So we are going to begin the last lecture of this seminar. And I have the honor of having with me Marco Mira Dercol. He was with us yesterday in one of the panels, but I think that their merits have not been highlighted enough. The fact of making these guides of the best practices for measuring subjective well-being, I think it's enough credential. It's impressive, all the research behind this document from the OECD, all thoroughly researched from the scales, the way to ask and to apply the questionnaire before the interviewee. So it's very impressive, the work done, and it's advisable for all of you related to measuring subjective well-being, because it compilates a lot of bibliography and impressive information. But even though yesterday he was introduced, I need to highlight again that Marco, in the Division of Statistics of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has been the Division of Household Statistics and Progress Measurement. He has been the editor or some of the flashes of the organization as society at a glance, and growing unequal. Fundamental publications related also to the distribution of poverty and income. He also worked on social progress, appointed by Nicolas Sarkozy. He has also experience, he has worked in the IMF, and he's graduated from Modena University with a master's degree in Oxford, and all his work is really a reference for the Statistics Institute, not only for the country members of the OECD, but for any national statistics agency. So I'm going to debut with a keynote lecture by Marco regarding subjective well-being and its relevance in discussing public.
Do you hear me now? Yes. Good morning, everybody. It is for me a great honor to talk in this last session. I have to say also it's a bit intimidating. You know, I've never delivered before a lectio magistral, the way I was introduced. You know, I'm not a scientific, I'm not an academic. I do not even qualify as a researcher on subjective well-being. I'm a civil servant in a big international organization where I work on the interface between research and policy, and where we work on an agenda on well-being and progress, of which the issue that we have discussed today on subjective well-being are a part, but only a little part. And we'll be discussing on this issue about what subjective well-being tells us about policy from the specific perspective of my work at the OECD. But before I give you my consideration, I have to thank a lot the organizer, Inegi and Flasco, for the wonderful experience that this seminar has been. I was thinking when Margherita said earlier that there is a test of 3-to-1 of positive to negative affects that qualify a happy person, and I was thinking that they fully meet those criteria. On the negative one, we have to count the jet lag, the fact that this morning we were up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and so the attention after in the afternoon start to decline at an exponential rate. The second would be to count some of the difficulties in following now, the discussion in a language that is not your own, so I relied for a while on the translation until Saverio, my Italian colleague, convinced me that I could follow even without it. In fact, I think I was able to catch up, I think, a significant part of the discussion. What I count on the positive effect side? Well, first of all, I arrived with a beautiful weather. We left Paris with the longest winter probably in the 25 years that I've been there. So arriving in a place with 25 degrees changes your perspective of many things, even on work. The second thing is a beautiful city. I arrived, I was the day before the start of the conference, and after meeting the colleagues in INEGI, I spent the afternoon at the Museo Antropologico, and I was simply overwhelmed. I'm Italian, so we still think of Cristoforo Colombo as having discovered the Americas, and when you arrive and you are confronted with the sheer size, quantity, it is simply overwhelming, and it gives you a very different perspective of what the Americas are about. The second thing that we need to count as on the positive side is, of course, always the opportunity to meet many friends, old and new. We have been in touch now with Gerardo, with other colleagues in INEGI for a number of years, with Mariano, who has been associated with our work at USCD for several years, John Elwell and others, but also people that I met for the first time, or people with whom we have been in contact for long, but through emails, but I never had a face associated to them. This is the case for the chair of our session. Another element that I would count is the learning. I think when Dr. Soos opened the conference, told us we are here to listen and to learn. And I have to say that I was familiar as I am with the work of INEGI and with the work of some of the academics. I was very impressed by the extent to which the discussion on well-being seems to have permeated different levels of policy discussion, especially the session that we had yesterday on which testifies how this concept and the reflection on how best to achieve people well-being has permeated at the local level, at the municipal levels. It is an issue that came out quite strongly also at a recent OECD Work Forum that we held in Delhi. Much of our work at OECD is on national countries, but of course there is a strong demand that probably at the local level that's where the policies can really make a difference, and I think that there is a lot that other countries can learn from the experience of Mexico and other Latin American countries. And the last element that I would count as very weighting very heavily on my positive effect is the exposure to perspective coming from a very different range. I'm an economist, but I think we will never be able to do justice. That's worn out? Oh, yes, maybe I take it on. Yes. No, to the issues of well-being and progress if we remain confined to a discussion among economists. So the idea of confronting ourselves with the perspective of psychologists, philosophers, pedagogists, sociologists, is something that we should take much more, face much more squarely in the future. The economists had hold a sort of imperialist hold on many of the public policy discussions in recent years, and I don't think that has been something that has helped a lot the discussion on well-being. I think the confrontation with the perspective that comes from a range of different disciplines is something that will be very important to give content and to make progress in this field. Now, when you come last, of course, many of the things that you are going to say will repeat, or at least echo points that have been made by previous speaker. I will not try to be original, so some of the things that you will hear from me you have heard before. it is not necessarily always bad. I mean, something that I remember from my experience with when we were working with the Stiglitz Commission, is at some point I told Jean-Paul Fitoussi, listen, we have a report where some of the points are repeated second, third time, and so on. So we could have a much more to the point report if we were simply to take out all the repetition. And he was telling me, oh, no, don't worry. You need to repeat things at least 3 times in order for them to stick in people's mind. So if you hear something that will be repeating, take it from that positive side. It's most likely to stick. So what I will aim to do in this intervention, I will not so much focus on subjective well-being as such. No, many people much more qualified than I am have been talking about it before. What I will try to do is to provide you with some of the background and context within which the OECD is pursuing work in this field, and some indication about our plans in the future, and my own personal take about the issue about the use of subjective well-being in the policy process. The first point that I wanted to make is that the work at the OECD on subjective well-being is part of the broader agenda that goes under the name of a Better Life Initiative. This was an initiative that was announced by the OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria in the spring of 2011 in the context of the OECD 50th anniversary. Now, the anniversary was held under a motto that then has stuck at the OECD, which was that of better policies for better lives. And to some extent, the motto itself tells you something important about what has been the goal of the OECD engagement in this field. The goal was partly that of recasting the image of an organization that for many years had been perceived as for taking a very traditional focus on economic efficiency as the only criteria for assessing public policies, and for pursuing growth at all costs. Even today, the OECD still releases one of its major publications, something which is called Going for Growth. So there is no adjective added to growth. It's not green growth, it's not inclusive growth. So that tells you something about the type of culture from which the organization was starting. And so this effort of, in a sense, of recasting the image of the organization is something that today is being pursued through pursued and mainstreamed throughout the different part of the house for a project which is called New Approaches on Economic Challenges, which is something that the Secretary General started saying, no, we need to put on paper and to be plain about what we have learned from 6 years of the crisis. And it is work ongoing, but somehow it is very important for those of us within the OECD that have been more longer associated with this agenda of well-being, because it shows to some extent the extent to which this idea that GDP growth is not the legitimate objective for policies, and that well-being is something that is as a claim to be taken as such, is starting to permeate different parts of the organization. Now, this Better Life Initiative had 2 main outputs. One was the report, which I showed in the presentation which I did yesterday, which was called How is Life, and which was basically an effort to benchmark and compare countries' achievements in terms of a dashboard of indicators for well-being, both average performance and inequalities, and put together some of the analysis of what we know about the determinants for outcome in this various domain. The second output was something that was shown by one of the participants to the previous round table. It is something which we called the Your Better Life Index, and it is something which we developed mainly as a communication tool to respond again to one recommendation that was in the report of the Stiglitz Commission. For all economists and statisticians that have been involved in this agenda, they know that the idea of a single indicator would be a sort of holy grail that people have been searching for decades. But to some extent, No, the report of the Security Commission was quite straightforward in saying it is not something on which statisticians will never reach agreement. Decision about what are the dimensions, what are the weights to be attributed to each dimension is something that belongs to the democratic processes within each society. But what is important for statisticians is to provide the elements for people to make their own decisions on these things. And so what the Your Better Life Index does is that it allows users to compare performance based on their own judgments about the relative importance that they want to attribute to health relative to income or relatively to education or relative to something else. In the slide that was presented early on, you had each country was characterized by a flower. The height of the flower was the overall performance. The length of each petal was the performance in the specific field, and then the width of the petal is the weight that the user attribute to the different dimensions. So we stress very much that this is not an OECD Better Life Index, it is your Better Life Index. We are putting the information together, and we like people to make those choices. It has been a tool that has been extremely popular since its release. There have been more than 1 million users that played with the tool, and it is something which we are committed to maintain, to extend, and we're adding new functionalities. Now, underpinning both this analytic and the communication aspect, then there was a broader range of less visible but important for us, as we are in the Statistics Directorate, activities whose aim is that of providing a better foundation for measurement of people well-being in the future. I mean, the well-being guidelines, the guidelines on subjective well-being that we put on the floor have that type of objective, encouraging more people more national statistical offices to enter that measurement space and to generate a generation of better statistics in that field. But as was mentioned by the president of Flaxco in the opening, the agenda of developing better metrics goes much beyond of measuring well-being, and we are currently lacking metrics in a huge number of fields. So in a few, we have been undertaking work in a number of areas, and we will be releasing, for example, simply in a few weeks, a report which provide guidelines on the measurement of the distribution of household wealth, which is something, a dimension which is very important from the perspective of measuring people's material conditions, but where few systematic measurement effort exists in member countries and no international standard existed until now. At the core of this OECD Better Life initiative is a framework for thinking about what well-being is about and for identifying the dimensions. Now, one issue that came out in this meeting that we will discuss before the meeting with the colleague of Ineki was how can we achieve greater convergence between this measurement initiative. Now, to some extent, you can accept that the selection of dimensions could be different from country to country. But I think it would be important at least to agree on a set of principles on which that selection could be based. And the principle that we use at the OECD, which I would argue they have a claim to be relevant for a variety of this application, are first that the focus is on people. We're not talking about the economic system, we are not talking about the natural system. It is very much focused on people experience, and in a way that make each person counts. So which implies that any assessment and any benchmarking or comparison of well-being will have to take account both measures of average achievements and a measure of inequalities. I say inequalities plural because somehow if on the side of measuring performance, the idea that there is more to GDP is now very widely accepted. Now, when you think about measuring inequalities, there is always a strong tendency of thinking that everything can be reduced to income inequalities. And of course, you can make a claim that not income inequality, they shape a range of other outcomes and other experience, but it's not always the case. And so it is important that adequate metrics of inequalities in a range of other domains are also developed. The second criteria was about thinking about outcomes. So we are not measuring inputs, we are not measuring outputs. No, those are things that you can think that they will vary from country to country. Each will have its own receipt for how to achieve a better life. But the idea of outcomes is that of thinking of aspects that are valuable in themselves and not only instrumentally for achieving something else. The third criteria was about thinking about both objective and subjective dimensions. I think the issue came up a number of times in the discussion yesterday. I mean, what we mean by subjective is dimensions where achievements can only be observed by the person in questions. Now, of course, it is true, as was made the point yesterday by one of the participants in my panel, that you have biomarkers, for example, that allows you to verify on the basis of brain activities whether a person is happy or not. But these are typically tests that are applied on a very small scale, and we regard as relevant when it comes to establishing the credibility and the validity of the measure, rather than being something that defines the dimension as such. So I think it is important to recognize that there are both objective dimensions which are observable from a third party and subjective dimensions that are where only the person in question can report. And then it is important that even for objective dimension, recognize that there is a role to be played by both objective measure and self-report of people. So we are dealing with aspects that can be subjective in different way, either intrinsically subjective because they cannot be assessed by a third party, or subjective in the sense that they are based on people's self-report. And I think even when we talk about measures of material conditions, there is a legitimate role to be played by a range of this self-report. And the last criteria that we will put forward is that of course, any assessment about well-being is not only well-being here and now in a specific place, but also an assessment over time, and hence the importance of factoring sustainability. There was one of the speakers yesterday that said, of course, that was pointing to an implicit tensions in any list of dimension. Of course, when we put forward our framework, we said that these are the dimensions that, in our view, have a claim to be relevant for people around the world. But of course, we recognize well that it is not because the OECD says so, or because in the Stiglitz Commission has a similar list of dimensions that disestablish the legitimacy of any set. Legitimacy, and it's something that we have learned from the initiative that many countries have put in place in these years, lies in the quality of the deliberations that are used to reach those type of agreement. And this is and all this consultation process has been very important, both in this experience of Italy and in the experience of the UK. But at the same time, we are convinced that the call for putting well-being at the center of public policy is not a call for a complete cultural relativism. Though some deliberation in some countries, you may think that they may reflect stereotype that may stifle rather than promote people's autonomy and agency. And a case in point came from the reference that John Halliwell made yesterday to his recent participation to a seminar in one of the Emirates states in the Middle East. Something he told us about his experience. He was saying, these are countries that are investing heavily in this agenda, but when they measure well-being, they made the choice of limiting the measures to nationals of those countries, which implies omitting 80% of immigrants which have a residence in the place, but which somehow they've been decided they are not relevant for public policy. So of course, there are. It is not because a process is deliberative that you will necessarily end up with making choices that you will want to endorse internationally or transpose to different places. At the same time, something that we have learned from those countries that have engaged in these discussions, like Italy, UK, Mexico, is that there is a lot in common when you look at the dimensions that are typically selected. So, and there is, in addition, a legitimate interest from the part of politicians and public opinion in countries comparing themselves with each other. So, you need to wait and expect that there will be a core set of dimensions that have been acclaimed to be relevant throughout the world. Now, in the OECD framework that we use for our report, in general, we distinguish between material conditions, which have to do with economic possibilities, economic well-being, command over commodities on one side, and quality of life, which relate instead to all those attributes of individuals and communities that are not reflected in market outcomes. And of course, one of the dimensions within quality of life is that of subjective well-being, which, as was said repeatedly over the days, people now understand as combining aspects of evaluation, aspect of affects, and aspect of meaning and purpose. I should say that subjective well-being is more than one of the 11 dimensions in the OECD framework. A lot of the interest in this agenda has been resulted from the exponential growth in research in this field. And it has a special role within, when you think about well-being in general, because it is a dimension that is sensitive to a broad range of other aspects, and this is quite unique. You don't have it in when you look at measures of. You don't have it necessarily when you look at measures of people's security or relational connections with others. The fact that they are sensitive to this range of other dimensions allows estimating the relative importance of these other factors in the perspective of producing subjective well-being, and that somehow provides a matrix for comparing this different effect. The special role of subjective well-being within this framework is such that by some authors at least, subjective well-being is sometimes represented as the single proxy of people's utility, with everything else just determining important as right-hand side determinant of this single proxy. But I have to say very clearly that this has never been the view that we have ever taken at the OECD. For once, on one side, we have always argued that subjective well-being itself is not a single quantity because it combines different aspects. You will need anyway to face a challenge about how you think that you could bring this, this three aspect of evaluation, affects, and eudaimonia together. They are conceptually separate aspects in the sense that they tap on different experiences of life. They have different type of drivers. So it is not obvious that they should and that they could be aggregated into single measures. But the second point, and I think is even more important, is that even conceptually, you could argue that subjective well-being has no claim for superiority relatively to other dimensions. There will be circumstances where it is right to be happy and circumstances where it is right not to be. There is a book that was published recently by Robert Skidelsky, which is an economist, which is quite famous because he did one of the better known biography of John Maynard Keynes, which is called How Much is Enough? And Skidelsky asked, for a variety of life circumstances, what is there to be happy about? And the issue is not simply that in many circumstances, that in those circumstances, there is nothing to be happy about and your subjective well-being is low, but that subjective well-being is not all that people care about. And because of this, it is not always the unconditional goal for policy. There will be a range of circumstances where you could, conditions that have to do with more traditional aspect of economic resources and material condition will be very important for countries, and the relative priority that it is recognized to all these dimensions is something that belongs to the political process in these countries. But I'm not here, of course, not to downplay the importance of subjective well-being. We are not among the skeptics who have ever argued that the subjective well-being does not bring anything new in public discourse on people's life. And this is why we have engaged a very significant work program of work on these issues. So it is important, it changes how we think about a range of policy challenges. And I wanted to illustrate this with respect to two roles that subjective well-being can play, two among others, but they're not much been talked over the past 2 days, so I wanted to put them forward. The first is the role of subjective well-being data in monitoring progress. Much of the evidence that we have been seeing in this meeting refers to comparison at a point in time between average level of subjective well-being and average level of GDP. And of course, there is a whole discussion, lively discussion about academics, about what should we make about the curvilinear relationship between the two variables. Some economists have taken the view that yes, it is curvilinear, but after all, it is logarithmic. So if it is logarithmic, it implies that if you take the rate of change of GDP, that will translate one-to-one into change in subjective well-being. It is a discussion where I don't want to enter now, but the important, I think the important point that instead I wanted to stress is that we have now much evidence about change in subjective well-being, and that this brings a lot of new light to some of the to the perspective that you take about changes living condition in countries. One piece of evidence where some of you will be familiar was presented in the regional conference that we organized in Mexico City a couple of years ago, presented by the people responsible for the Gallup World Poll, and they referred to the experience of a number of Arab countries before the Arab Spring. Tunisia was a country where per capita GDP increased by 7% in the 2 years to 2010, and the same was happening to health and education. Tunisia was one of the champions in terms of the evolution of the HDI. However, when you look at measures about life satisfactions, the proportion that Gallup classified as striving over the same 2 years was falling by 40%. A very similar pattern was happening in Egypt, where over 5 years to 2010, GDP per capita was increasing by 1/3, and the share of people thriving was being cut by half. So I think there is quite a lot of evidence that subjective well-being may fall despite higher GDP and higher material condition. But something else that maybe was not evident there, in fact it was not even evident by the time we wrote the guideline on subjective well-being, is that subjective well-being may also decline when an economic crisis hits. And it declines by much more than we had that could be expected. I think this is particularly evident if you look at countries in Europe, in Southern Europe, which are affected by one of the most severe crises in the post-war period. In Spain, over the 4 years to 2010, the average value of the country ladder fell by 14%. So by over 1 point. In the 1 point on a scale of 10 is a lot, and is especially a lot if you then try to translate it into an income equivalent, looking at the type of coefficient that are usually generated by in regression analysis. And the same pattern is existing in most other countries in Southern Europe. In Italy, it falls by 15%. In Greece, it falls by 23%. In Portugal, it falls by 14%. And this at the same time as in countries like Germany, it is increasing. And this is only one aspect in which the subjective well-being data can bring light to the monitoring of changes in people's condition. Oh, I'm already there. I thought that I would have been very quick, but I'm not. So it's only one way in which it affects. Another very typical feature that people had in the past is that people are often more optimistic in terms of subjective well-being 5 years from now than now. Well, this is a pattern that completely reversed. People are generally more optimistic about the prospect for their children than the prospect of them. It has completely reversed. The consequences are even more striking if you look at people's confidence in institutions. It's been cut by half, and this probably is going to be one of the most lasting heritage of the recession, because it's something that will impact on our capacity to recover, to the confidence that we have that our policymaker will be able to make something to improve things. The other point that I wanted to make is about the other roles of subjective well-being public policy is about assessing on-market outcomes. And here, the nature of the problems is relatively straightforward. Most public spending in OECD countries is about health, education, and retirement. So all programs that target different aspects of people's well-being. And then when you think about the type of tools that government are using for assessing the efficacy of their interventions, well, most of the time, it is an assessment of how much they cost. Sometimes, it is an assessment about the market impacts, how much GDP growth they generate. But when you look at about estimate of the total impacts, then there is conspicuously little. And that's where you could argue that subjective well-being has much light to bring, because they allow us to provide evaluation for this non-market impact. There were two examples that I wanted to quote very quickly of the type of research that in the OECD we have been doing on this field. One is in the field of social policies, where our colleagues have looked at, for a few countries where there are panel data, the impact of changes in policies on subjective well-being. And the case that they've looked in particular is about extension in parental leave. And when you look at those, at those measures, there is quite significant evidence that in countries with, like Germany, the impact is very strong. Germany is one of the countries implementing more of those changes in policies, and the evidence for Germany is very strong, and the evidence is similarly there, although weaker, for countries like United Kingdom and Belgium. Should not completely surprise us, of course. After all, that's why these policies exist. It is not by itself an argument for not making reforms sometimes that reduce the generosity of those benefits, but somehow we should bring home the point that any assessment of policy should be based on a full assessment of the costs and benefits. The other example that I wanted to give, but I will skip it, I will give it just very briefly, was on the environment field, where recently we have been looking at how subjective well-being can relate to objective measures of air quality by combining information on the zip code of the respondents to their place of living, and then to actual measures of air quality, such as concentration of particulate. And when you do it, you see that people, first of all, they are very good in assessing subjectively what the quality of those environmental conditions is. You see that this objective measure, they have a very discernible and significant impact on their life evaluations, and using objective measure allows you to get much more precise measures of the effects. If I do very quickly, so to making one further problem that one further issue that I wanted to raise is that I think we should in this room we have all been talking about subjective well-being, and of course there's a little convincing that needs to be done about why it is important. But I think that if we want to work towards a change in the paradigm in economics, I think we should be place the discussion of subjective well-being in a broader context, and in a context which takes account the way in which we interpret the behavior of people and the way in which we understand the functioning of markets. When we talk about the behavior of people, we are all familiar with the standard description in textbooks. The individuals are selfish, they are given preferences, they do what is best for them. We have learned from behavioral economics that many of these assumptions do not hold true. And it is only when you take home that point that the distinction between actions and outcomes and well-being get silent. And I think we need to to better incorporate and reflect the findings of behavioral economics in the context of our discussion. And the similar argument with respect to the functioning of markets. The macroeconomic textbook will generally tell you that the asset prices reflect all the fundamental information on prices, that there are no bubbles, that markets gravitate over equilibrium, that the demand for good is always determined by the capacity of markets to produce it. Again, 6 years in the crisis, many of those beliefs do not hold true, but unless we are able to relay these different elements, it will be difficult to achieve this change in paradigm of which we sometimes talk. The last point I wanted to make, and then I close, is that we will continue to work on these issues in the future. In subjective well-being, I mentioned the seminar that we're planning to do for the uptake. We will do conducting research on the policy effect of affect data and on the cultural biases. But more generally, on our work on well-being in general, we will be working toward the release of a new edition of How is Life in October. We will be pursuing work in some of the areas where we know that our colleague Inegi have significant expertise and interest, like the measurement of volunteering and violence against women. And lastly, we will be continue to provide a forum where countries, practitioners, academics, statisticians can confront experience in this field. We did it last time in Delhi in October 2000 last year, and we are very pleased that the next OECD World Forum will be held in Mexico City, co-organized with our colleague in Inegi. So it will be an opportunity important for us for deepening our partnership with actors in the region, and we are looking forward to this experience. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Marco.
Thank you very much, Marco. So, while we receive the written questions, I would like to comment two important things. Why INEGI adopts the framework of the OECD for measuring subjective well-being? Well, not only because Mexico is a member country of this organization, not only because the law that governs INEGI, it's the National Statistical and Geographic Information, sets forth that INEGI should be updated with regard to international rules, but also there's a great maturity in this work carried out by OECD, not only in methodologies to measure subjective well-being, but also from the standpoint of the conceptual framework. The OECD, for OECD, is not the same as subjective well-being and happiness. These are components of life satisfaction, emotional balance, and meaningful life, and they understand these three elements are fundamental. Why is this important? Well, because oftentimes this idea of happiness and subjective well-being can be confused with an hedonic position. We might think about a drug trafficker that is very happy in an hedonic sense, but maybe he has problems to find meaning to his life, and particularly that of others. So this is an adult approach to subjective well-being, and also your vision regarding quality of life of the OECD, it's an element, but within a sustainability framework, economic sustainability and world sustainability. So the message of the OECD is that subjective well-being doesn't mean to procure to have a party today and let's see what happens tomorrow. So it's a mature framework from the methodological standpoint and conceptually with its vision of individuals and also from the macro standpoint. So it's not quite simple. So here we have the questions with different handwriting.
The Better Life Index ranks very high
the rich, depressive, and suicide countries. Is it a contradiction to the original idea that happiness is more than objective life conditions? I think it's better that you, because it's quite long. Porque es bastante larga la pregunta, ¿no?
Well, I don't think it is a contradiction. I mean, first, at one level, no, the point that I made is that no, the ranking can change if you decided that you want to value more other aspects than your income, than your the suicide or something else. No, there is not a unique ranking, and the interest of the application is that to some extent it shows to users how the relative position of countries can change according to this to the different choices. That said, I mean, I would not be too much surprised by some of the by the fact that some of the countries like the Scandinavian countries and Australia and Canada typically rank high on that on that measures for a range of possible choices that you could make. At least for the for within European countries, the Scandinavians have come to best to provide the best example of countries that to some extent have been able to combine criteria of economic efficiency with criteria of equity, and so the fact that they are not necessarily the richest among the OECD countries, but they perform relatively high. The United States, for a variety of choices, they're high, that they can be very at the top of the close to the top of the scale, but they can also move down if you take greater account of other dimensions. One aspect that, for example, always strikes me when you compare the performance of the United States relative to European countries, if you look at life expectancy at birth, in the 60s, the United States had a higher life expectancy than Italy. It has been completely, was an advantage that has completely been reversed and went in the opposite direction over the next 20, 40 years, 20, 30 years. And this at the same time as gap in GDP per capita were going exactly in the opposite direction. So there is a lot of, there is not a one-to-one association between either the level of the changes of many of these variables. And so you should expect that for different choices, you could end up with different ranking.
There is a second half in this question, but I think it's quite long. I think that we'll return to this later on.
Esta pregunta es,
This question,
es prioritario el bienestar relacionado con el tema.
so well-being related to the environment, is it a priority?
The environmental issue, how it ranks in terms of well-being.
Well, I think when we think about well-being, the environment enters in two different ways. On one side, we have included a dimension for environmental quality in the here and now, in the framework that we've been put forward. Although the set of measures that are currently included are very limited. They're mainly limited to measures of air quality, and this is because of our constraints of being able to compare 34 OECD countries. But then there is a bigger role that, of course, you can make that the environment plays as part of the sustainability assessment that you would like to guarantee. We said the agenda of well-being is not only to maximizing well-being in the here and now. Sustainability has to enter in some way in the assessment. It remains the weaker part of the of the exercise, both in the OECD exercise and in the type of application that member countries have been doing to it. We will include a chapter about what do we mean by sustainability of well-being over time in the next edition of How is Life. It will include, we hope, a more adequate set of indicators. But the issue is very conceptually very complicated. Basically, we are thinking, if you take seriously this idea about sustaining well-being, it implies that you need to think what is likely to be life expectancy 100 years from now. and what are the actions, the factors that are already evident today that will bear on those outcomes. Now, some of those actions may be already known and have to do with risk behavior on which we could, we may intervene, but many other factors step in between, and this understanding of the law of motions of these different outcomes is something that is still very premature and would be the big agenda that we face in the years ahead.
There's a next question from Raul Arriola. Says, you suggest a log plot of subjective well-being and GDP correlation. Theory tells us that a log-log correlation could lead to spurious correlation. Have you measured the degree of spurious correlation in your well?
It gets into a technical issue. The point, the way that most people with some familiarity in econometrics will take it when they look at the time series of two variables is that if one variable is trending over time like GDP, and if another variable is stationary because it fluctuates around a more or less constant level, then you need to transform the first variable to put it into changes as well. And so that's what leads to the conclusion that when you look at from the perspective of the macroeconomic application, it makes a lot of sense to look at changes in GDP per capita and how it affects the levels of subjective well-being. It is a discussion that is taking place where people taking different views. Angus Deaton has been very strong, for example, in Daily to say, well, after all, if the log linear transformation is if the transformation of GDP versus income, it is perfectly linear, we are back to square one. So we are still making the case that changes in material conditions are very effective in improving people's subjective well-being at any level of development. Now, what is limited in that argument, in my view? The fact that the richer the countries become and the closer they get to a sort of efficiency frontier, the more difficult it gets to them to double their GDP from one year to the next, so to increase it by 10%. It may be possible for countries that are very down, very low on the rank of GDP per capita, but the more you move up, the more those type of changes in GDP becomes difficult to achieve. So I think there is a strong sense in which we are saying that a strong sense in which we should take the idea of a diminishing marginal utility to income from that type of evidence.
Two more questions. One from George Blank. What actions could or should be done in direction of the education system in order to diffuse these ideas among young people? Is OECD planning some actions in this direction?
It is one of those areas where we are seeing at the OECD and beyond that how this idea of learning to live rather than learning to work is starting to take hold in the policy discourse. It was the main point made by one of the speakers this morning. There are themes that emerge in the discussion about the reform of education system in France. So they are starting to be very evident. At the OECD, I think one of the main tools that the OECD has put in place to monitor and to measure students' achievement is something which is called the PISA, which is a program for the competencies of students at the age of 15. In the next, already for the next PISA surveys, they will be introducing questions about students' subjective well-being in their surveys. There will be already some results probably coming out this year, and I think it was something that has a potential to change the perspective of educational policies from regarding kids as object where basically you have to put in as many competencies as things to know as you can, from recognizing them as agents where that they should go to school to get a sense of a life worth living rather than than getting stuff with abstract notion of which those application then can be limited. I think there are countries probably. If I have my kids who are enrolled in the French education system, which is very much imbued with these traditional ideas of learning more and more notions, quite competitive system, and very little attention to the flourishing of the kids. Other education systems don't have the same attitude, and we hope very much that when you start to have measures on those things in some of the tools that the OECD is implemented, they could help to change the perspective that educational ministers take to those issues.
This is the last question with no name. It's in Spanish. I'll try to translate it.
Which would be the main arguments you may use in order to convince authorities of a poor country in order to the country measure subjective well-being, which the main arguments you would provide to the authorities of a poor country?
My sense, what I took from the daily forum that we organized this year is that selling subjective well-being measure to some of the countries that are less developed statistical system remains an hard sell. Especially when you think about some of the African countries which have a very, they face huge tasks simply to implement some of the basic measures like population censuses, some of the measures of inflation and so on. And the argument to which we are typically confronted, which I think is partly, I can see where it comes from, but I don't think it should be taken at face value, is that there is a hierarchy of statistical priorities. Let's get first the basic done, and then let's address these issues maybe in 10 years' time. Something that I think it is potentially changing the discussion is that first of all, we are seeing a political attention to this issue at the level of the discussion on the successor of the Millennium Development Goals. To the extent that this idea of a broader understanding of development will get mainstreamed into in the political deliberation in some of the targets, you could expect to get growing attention to those type of measures. And the other argument that I think we should be used is that there is, in fact, with new technologies, quite a significant possibilities for countries to leapfrog some of the stages of statistical development. We have been a lot of discussion in the OECD about big data. There are countries that are using those type of tools for measuring things like inflation. I don't think that you will ever have big data that can be used for measuring subjective well-being, but you could argue that if you implement those more, if you make the best use of this type of technologies, you are freeing up some space where this measurement undertaking in new concepts, in new fields could be implemented. And anyway, I mean, let's remind Bhutan, which is not a country which have the largest, one of the highest GDP per capita, has been pioneering this type of measure. When Gerardo was in Paris last week, we had a very eloquent presentation about the type of measures that Morocco put in place. So I think we are now in a phase where we are seeing champions of those type of measure in all continents. So it is getting harder and harder to argue that this is a measurement agenda for the rich countries.
Okay. With this, we conclude this session. Thank you very much, Marco.